We have built a massive security state apparatus that essentially runs our government at this point. There's a book out there, National Security and Double Government. And I'm blanking on the author's name right now, but he speaks to how, and he was looking at Britain first, but also in the United States, where there's this, elections come and go, presidents come and go, but the security state remains. Yeah. Right. And the security state, you could think of it as being composed of, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, and then the NSA, and sort of all the proliferation of these other agencies. And then they all work through the National Security Council, the NSC over at the White House, which is sort of the clearinghouse for the president in terms of these policies and goals. And so this, there are career, and they're staffed primarily by 90+% career individuals, right? They're not people who are there to serve this president. They're just there to serve in perpetuity in these roles as experts, right? Right. And it's so funny. In DC, being an expert literally just means that like you believe what everybody has told you to believe, and you're here to defend it. Yeah, you have Ukraine flag in bio. That's right. Yeah, it's just these people. The only thing that makes them an expert is that they've been saying the same thing for 15 years without ever considering how the world has changed around them. Yeah. And so President Trump has proposed the Schedule F, which is, fantastic. And, not only do we need to get our guys in, we need to get these guys out. Obviously, the federal bureaucracy is bloated. It could be significantly reduced. There's a lot of redundancies, even like, think of what we saw this past week. I don't know if you saw this video of Samantha Powers, who's the administrator of the USAID, right? So one of the things Trump proposed, and I think is brilliant and should happen, like USAID needs to be folded back into the State Department. Yeah. We don't need a separate USAID and State Department. Quite frankly, I think we could cut the whole USAID just in general, get rid of it. But she's over there filming and essentially publicly announcing that we're going to use American taxpayer dollars to sort of start funding a color revolution in Hungary, right? Because they use these phrases like media accountability, and what that means is they're going to fund media in Hungary that's going to counter the pro-Christian, pro-conservative, pro-family agenda over there, right? They're going to promote, they say, like, good governance and democracy. Okay, what they mean by that is, the LGBTQ agenda, right? And those are going to go to George Soros societies, so open society funded organizations. And so like all that stuff like has to go. But you have to realize, I guess what I'm trying to say here, Nick, is you have to realize the euphemisms that the security state uses to execute its agenda. Good governance, media accountability. Buzzwords. The buzzwords, right? Yeah. What do they really mean? Yeah, speaking of the LGBTQ agenda, we can talk about something else that usually goes hand in hand with that, which is support for intervention in Ukraine. Yeah. Seriously. So I think this is one of the areas that we've seen, the deep state really bounce back. I mean, just immediately after the Trump administration, the deep state strikes back. Yeah, they just rolled straight into like, cool, we're gonna direct a just ungodly amount of money, to this country halfway across the world. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. Because I want to go deeper than because a lot of people want to say Trump wouldn't have gotten us into that mess, but I want to go deeper than that because I don't necessarily think that is 100% the case. Like I think he would have some strategic. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. Yeah, well, I think one of the most important things to note about the whole Ukraine-Russia fiasco is that the Germans are deeply, deeply responsible for this. Their greed and their desire for the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the purpose of that is for them to buy, gas from Russia and get it into Europe, was one of the driving factors of this fight. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, they eventually stopped short of a major gas line there that Russian gas goes through, and they didn't want to destroy that. So that kind of held their ground. And so with the potential completion and the coming online of Nord Stream 2, I think Russia felt like they had the green light to go grab more land in Ukraine. And the Germans are deeply responsible for that. President Trump, told the Germans to their face that this was going to happen, and they laughed at him, and it happened. And he told the Germans they need to do more to fund defense of Europe, and they don't do it, right? So the Germans are deeply to blame. I think Trump, again, was one of the most successful foreign policy presidents we ever had. But one of the things we left on the board was, completely shutting down that pipeline in a legal and constitutional fashion. We could talk about maybe what Biden has done since then, as opposed to blowing it up. Seriously. And so the Germans are deeply at fault here. And quite frankly, this is a European problem. And honestly, a lot of people don't know this, but Germans actually have a fair bit of antipathy for the Ukrainians. So they don't really care about them. So they kind of led them into this mess in many ways, don't care about them. But fundamentally, this is a European issue, right? And so the European allies, Germany, France, the UK, they're the ones who need to be dealing with this. Like Russia's encroaching upon territory that's adjacent to them, not us. And so I think that if Trump were in office, would Putin have had the guts to invade? I don't know. And had that happened, I think our response would certainly look different. And one of the main ways our response would look different is that we would not be sort of continuing to fund European apathy towards this, but forcing them to step up and take accountability for the foreign policy mess on their own soil.
One of the things that I'd be curious to hear about there too is like NATO. What would Trump's relationship with NATO be like? What would he be charging them to do, in this circumstance?
Well, look, NATO is clearly in some ways like outliving its usefulness, right? I mean, what is the point of NATO if the Russians are going to do this? And of course, Ukraine's not a NATO ally, and thank the Lord for that, right?
Not for lack of trying.
And we absolutely should not let them into NATO. But so, I think, again, we constantly pressured NATO allies to step up and fund more of the NATO efforts and to take more seriously the threats that are most adjacent and, concerning to NATO partners. And so I think that we would be pressuring NATO in such a way that would cause sort of like the derision and the scorn of the foreign policy establishment, as it always did, if Trump was in office right now. And maybe, quite frankly, we would tell NATO, like, this is your problem, deal with it. And as much as it is, again, Ukraine is not a NATO treaty ally. So I think that's critical. And I think in some ways you want to keep NATO out of it. You want to keep NATO out of it to a certain extent because we don't want to get embroiled in a land war with Russia. That's always a good rule.